Canada is standing at the edge of a new era, one that could redefine its role on the global stage forever. 8 years of silence between Ottawa and Beijing just ended in a single handshake that left Washington fuming. When Mark Carney met Chinese President Xi Jinping, the world expected polite diplomacy. What they got instead was a calculated move that shook the balance of power from Washington to Seoul. This wasn't a photo op. It was a power play. For nearly a decade, no Canadian Prime Minister had been invited to China. That silence spoke volumes about mistrust, trade freezes, and the scars of Trump's tariff wars. But Carney changed that, calmly, confidently, and on his own terms. Behind closed doors, he made a promise that Canada would no longer be trapped between America's temper and Asia's hesitation. What followed next wasn't just a conversation. It was a declaration that Canada was done waiting for permission to lead. Because this meeting didn't just open doors. It opened an entire new chapter for a country finally ready to act like a power in its own right. For 8 long years, no Canadian Prime Minister had exchanged a single formal meeting with China's leadership. The reasons were complex: espionage accusations, diplomatic boycotts, and a political climate poisoned by mistrust. But underneath it all was fear. Fear of what Washington would say if Ottawa dared to rebuild ties. Trump's presidency made that fear worse. One day, he called Canada a great ally. The next, he slapped tariffs on steel, aluminum, and lumber without warning. That kind of chaos turned diplomacy into a guessing game. The result? Canada's trade ties with Asia froze, while China moved on with Europe and the rest of the world. So when Mark Carney walked into the APEC Summit in South Korea, he wasn't just attending another international forum. He was breaking the silence that had defined nearly a decade of hesitation. This meeting was long overdue, he told reporters. And it was. The invitation from Beijing had been extended, and for the first time in years, a Canadian leader didn't shy away from accepting it. This wasn't nostalgia. It was necessity. Carney understood something simple but powerful. Diplomacy isn't about choosing sides. It's about creating options. And Canada was finally running out of them.
At the APEC Summit, the air was thick with tension. Trump's absence dominated headlines, but Carney's quiet composure drew the real attention. Cameras caught the moment he shook hands with President Xi. A calm, deliberate exchange that said more than any speech could. For the first time in nearly a decade, the door between Ottawa and Beijing reopened. China invited Carney to visit officially, signaling the rebirth of dialogue after years of cold silence. Behind that handshake came agreements, re-establishing high-level talks, reopening trade channels, and beginning discussions to remove tariffs that had crippled Canadian exporters. But the symbolism ran deeper. The world saw Canada not as America's sidekick, but as a sovereign voice rebuilding its own alliances. For years, Washington dictated Ottawa's limits. Now, Carney was setting his own. He didn't bow or lecture. He simply built, with purpose. That handshake wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion. It was Canada telling the world, we will work with everyone, not just those who shout the loudest. And the shock wasn't that Xi accepted. It was how quickly global leaders noticed that shift. Canada was no longer waiting for U.S. permission to engage. It was charting its own course.
Carney used the APEC CEO Summit to lay out what he called the new architecture of Canadian power. Gone were the days of quiet diplomacy and economic dependence. His message was direct. The old world of predictable trade and American dominance is over. The future belongs to those who adapt, diversify, and lead through cooperation. He reminded the audience that Canada isn't a small player. It's an energy superpower, with the 3rd largest oil reserves, the 4th largest natural gas reserves, and one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world. 85% of Canada's power is already clean, and that figure will rise another 50% as nuclear and renewables expand. Then came the pivot: artificial intelligence, quantum technology, life sciences, and critical minerals. Sectors that once looked futuristic are now central to Carney's strategy to double Canada's non-US exports within the next decade. Deals with Germany on critical minerals, partnerships with the UAE on infrastructure and AI, and trade negotiations with Southeast Asian nations all signal one thing. Canada is no longer playing defense. It's playing offense. And this was the moment the world realized it.
What Carney revealed next turned heads in every capital. He's quietly building a $1 trillion infrastructure plan stretching across the Pacific. Not just roads and bridges, but a digital and clean energy grid linking Canadian ports to Asia's booming economies. He's mobilizing Canada's massive pension funds, the fourth largest in the world, to invest directly into these projects, bypassing old bureaucratic models. Every dollar is designed to multiply through long-term, sustainable growth. The plan includes green hydrogen pipelines, upgraded rail networks, smart ports in British Columbia, and digital corridors that connect data centers across the Pacific Rim. But Carney's approach is what sets it apart. He isn't relying on political noise or foreign bailouts. He's treating Canada's own financial muscle as the foundation for sovereignty. And that's why the world is listening. His goal is simple: create certainty in an age of chaos. As he said at APEC, certainty is the greatest currency in commerce. While other leaders chase short-term headlines, Carney is buying long-term influence through calm, calculated strategy. This blueprint isn't just about rebuilding infrastructure. It's about rebuilding confidence in Canada, by Canada, for Canada. Every turning point in history comes with a shadow. And for Canada, that shadow still wears the face of Donald Trump. When he launched his America First crusade, it wasn't just policy. It was economic warfare, disguised as patriotism. One day, Trump called Canada a friend. The next, he slapped 35% tariffs on aluminum and lumber, accusing his closest ally of unfair trade. The result was chaos. Factories halted production, farmers saw exports vanish overnight, and investors panicked. Billions evaporated, not because of competition, but because of unpredictability. Mark Carney lived through that storm. He watched as careful negotiations were undone by 3 a.m. tweets and erratic tantrums that turned allies into enemies. And he learned a lesson that would shape his entire foreign strategy. Never build your economy on someone else's mood. Carney realized that Canada's survival couldn't depend on America's next election cycle. It needed resilience, a safety net woven from partnerships across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So while Trump weaponized trade, Carney weaponized diplomacy. He replaced confrontation with cooperation, and rage with reason. When Trump raised walls, Carney opened doors. He didn't respond with insults, he responded with invitations to new markets, new investors, and new alliances. That contrast is now defining North America's new reality. The U.S. talks about dominance, while Canada practices balance. Trump's vision alienated allies. Carney's approach is winning them back. And as Washington's influence shrinks under the weight of its own arrogance, Canada is emerging not as a follower, but as the voice of stability the world has been waiting for. Because in a century where noise rules politics, Carney's calm is power, and it's changing everything about how the world sees Canada. Mark Carney's rise isn't built on bravado. It's built on balance. While many Western leaders choose confrontation, Carney has mastered the art of quiet power. His strategy is subtle yet effective. Speak less, achieve more. He knows that in today's volatile world, shouting doesn't command respect. Consistency does. And that's exactly what he's delivering. Critics accuse him of cozying up to China, but Carney's approach is far more sophisticated. He isn't submitting to Beijing, he's engaging it, carefully, pragmatically, and on Canada's terms. Engagement, he often says, doesn't mean endorsement.
Dialogue doesn't equal dependence. It means leverage, the ability to influence outcomes from within, not from the sidelines. That's why Carney's diplomacy has started to reshape how the world views Canada. Nations across Asia, from Thailand and the Philippines to Malaysia, are now opening their doors to Canadian trade, seeing in Carney a trustworthy partner amid the unpredictability of Washington. Even Europe is quietly aligning with his vision, viewing Canada as a bridge between democratic values and emerging markets. Carney's methodical style has earned him something that can't be bought: credibility. When he speaks, markets listen. When he acts, investors follow. And while other leaders chase headlines and applause, Carney is building relationships that last beyond political cycles. He's redefining leadership for a new generation, proving that influence doesn't have to roar to be felt. It can whisper, negotiate, and build foundations that last. Canada's power under Carney isn't loud or flashy. It's steady, strategic, and deeply respected. Because in a world consumed by chaos and noise, quiet strength has become Canada's most valuable export, and Carney is its architect.
For decades, Canada First was more a slogan than substance, a phrase politicians used but rarely practiced. Under Mark Carney, that's changed. His entire strategy is rooted in one principle: protect Canadians from the chaos of others. When he talks about trade diversification, it's not abstract policy. It's a shield designed for real people. For the farmer in Saskatchewan, it means new buyers in Asia who pay fair prices without American interference. For engineers in Toronto, it means global contracts for clean energy projects funded by partners from Europe and the Middle East. For small business owners in Vancouver, it means not waking up to another tweet from Washington that destroys a year's worth of export plans. Carney's diplomacy might look global, but its impact is deeply local. Every handshake abroad translates to jobs, investments, and stability back home. This is what he means by Canada First. Not isolation or nationalism, but independence. A nation confident enough to cooperate without compromising. By broadening partnerships and reducing dependency, Carney is building a future where Canada thrives no matter who occupies the White House. Critics call it risky. Supporters call it revolutionary. But for Carney, it's simply logical. The world is shifting fast, from fossil fuels to renewables, from U.S. dominance to multipolar balance. If Canada doesn't adapt, it will be left behind. So instead of clinging to nostalgia, Carney is crafting resilience. He's ensuring that when the next trade war erupts or another superpower stumbles, Canada stands tall, unshaken, prepared, and prosperous. Because for the first time in decades, Canada isn't just reacting to global change. It's leading it. And that, more than anything, is what Canada First finally means.
At the APEC Summit, the world witnessed something subtle but seismic: a shift in global tone. While some leaders spoke in slogans and threats, Mark Carney spoke in strategy and conviction. He didn't arrive to dominate the room. He arrived to redefine it. The atmosphere changed the moment he took the stage. His words were measured. His delivery calm. Yet every sentence landed with purpose. By the end of his address, even the skeptics were listening, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Carney declared what few dared to say aloud. The old era of predictable, U.S.-controlled trade is over. The world, he said, is entering an age of diversified power, where reliability is the new currency. And in that new world, Canada has what others lack: credibility, stability, and trust. Those words hit harder than any political jab because they came from a leader who practices what he preaches.
When Carney later shook hands with Xi Jinping, it wasn't just a diplomatic photo. It was a signal to every nation watching. Canada was done waiting in the background. It was ready to lead on its own terms. Even journalists who once dismissed Canada as a quiet middle power began using a new phrase: the steady hand of the North. Because while others fuel division and chaos, Carney represents something increasingly rare: reason. His brand of leadership has no fireworks, yet it outlasts every headline. At APEC, the message was unmistakable. Canada isn't following anyone's script anymore. It's writing its own. And as global alliances fracture and new powers emerge, Carney has positioned his nation at the center of the conversation, not as a spectator, but as a force shaping the next chapter of world order.
When historians look back on this moment, they won't see it as just another diplomatic trip or a polite exchange between leaders. They'll see it as the day Canada decided to stand on its own. For nearly a century, Canada's fate was tied to the moods, markets, and politics of its southern neighbor. Every economic storm that started in Washington eventually hit Ottawa. Every tariff, every sanction, every election ripple affected Canadian lives. But with Mark Carney's meeting in China, that cycle was finally broken. He didn't shout, threaten, or grandstand. He simply walked into a room that had been closed to Canada for 8 long years and reopened it with reason, confidence, and purpose. It wasn't about choosing sides between America and China. It was about choosing Canada. Choosing stability over chaos, partnerships over politics, and long-term progress over short-term applause. This moment marks the rebirth of Canadian leadership, one built not on slogans but on strategy. Carney's message to the world is clear. Canada will no longer be defined by others' decisions. It will define its own destiny. The handshake in Seoul may have lasted only seconds, but its impact will echo for decades. It proved that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly and changes the world quietly. Carney's vision has given Canada something priceless: not dominance, but dignity; not isolation, but influence. The kind of leadership that earns trust rather than demands loyalty. And that's what this new era is about: a Canada that stands firm, leads wisely, and acts boldly. Because the age of waiting is over. The age of Canadian leadership has just begun.